Hey folks, today we're going to try something a little bit different. Instead of looking at a specific person, we're going to look at a group of people, and unlike the past three videos, these people had two X chromosomes instead of one. And in continuing with the different style that I've established here, we won't necessarily look at the lives of these female composers, especially since there's not a lot of info out there on them individually, but rather their musical and societal contributions, how they fit into the historical narrative of music, and how they're a part of the exploration of gender in music. So, who am I talking about? I'm talking about the Trobairitz. Now that that mystery is revealed, let's get into who they were. The Trobairitz were French female composers from Occitania, which is in modern-day southern France, and they were most prominent between the years 1170 and 1260. They were courtly women who had received education in etiquette, language, and art, more like this art, and not surprisingly, most of them were either the daughter or wife of a male poet-composer, a troubadour. Their high level of education was not rare among high-class French women, so it does cause one to wonder, why are they all from Occitania? Side note, there were other female composers in other parts of France, but Trobairitz, Occitania. Anyways, one possibility is that women in Occitania had greater societal and legal freedoms than women in other areas of France. And since these noblewomen were the audience members and subjects of male troubadour poetry, the step towards composing them some themselves wasn't that big of a one to make. As with many other things, historians don't agree about the exact number of Trobairitz that existed, but it's estimated there between 15 and 21. I was surprised by how few women there were, but one article cleared this up for me by pointing out that one, women were still subordinate to men at this time, and two, that anonymity in music was the norm. So we only have 5 biographies of Trobairitz, which are for Thibaut's Comtesse de Dia, who's the author of the largest surviving Trobairitz work, including the only surviving pair of both poem and musical score. Then we have Azalea de Porquerolles, Casalosa, and Lombarda. The rest of the Trobairitz are mentioned in other troubadours' biographies and commentaries. Some Trobairitz only have one poem attributed to them, but these attributions may be inaccurate considering that a lot of these poems are compiled into one large manuscript. And what's even more confusing is that poetry attributed to an unidentified Trobairitz could even have been written by a male troubadour using the female voice as a literary device. This is rare, but all in all, it's no wonder it's difficult to figure out the exact number. But hold up, how did we get from antiquity to here? It's important to see how the Trobairitz fit into the narrative of women in music because it's not as though women in music didn't exist before. So let's go on a brief journey back in time. Women have been involved in music since its creation. In fact, the prophetess Miriam is described in the Old Testament of the Bible as singing and playing instruments. In ancient Greece, women's choruses had prominent roles in festivals of the 5th and 6th centuries BCE. However, the ancient philosopher Plato did separate the sexes, even in music, by recommending certain masculine styles for men and more sweet and submissive styles for women because of their separate emotional and sexual differences. Philosophers in this time also first differentiated between respectable female musicianship, which normally involved domestic performance, and female musician entertainers who were seen to have an unclean sexual status. Differences between the sexes were also evident in Jewish services for centuries, where women were not allowed to participate in certain recitative aspects of the service, leading to the formation of separate sex choirs. Similarly, women in the early Christian church were required by law to remain silent, as the female voice had too much of a sexual connotation to it. However, that's not to say that in practice women were a homogeneous group of submissive individuals. In fact, Charlemagne, the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, decreed in 789 that nuns should not be writing love songs, which tells us, well, that some of them were. The monastic movement of the 6th century had solidified the establishment of convents, some of which produced significant musical works and provided women with substantial music education. So the stage was set for female composers like the nun Cassia, the great female poet of the 9th century and the only woman to have her works included in liturgy. Around the time of the Trobairitz, Hildegard von Bingen, the composer of the most attributable plain chant of the Middle Ages, was also composing. Between the 11th and 16th centuries, secular works in the vernacular had gained popularity, and genres devoted to the female perspective had begun to take shape. So while we may look at the Trobairitz as a phenomenon of sorts, we can see now that while they were significant in their contributions, they weren't the first or only female composers. and by studying them individually, we ignore how they fit into not only history but also society. One such example of this is the term itself, Trobairitz, which was not used by the composers themselves or their male counterparts, but was rather included in an Occitanian novel written towards the end of the height of the Trobairitz called Roman de Flamenca. Just in talking about them, we unduly separate them from the troubadours. It's sort of like how my mom gets mad that we don't use the same pronunciation for other countries as they use for themselves. The lack of the term Trobairitz at the time of their composing makes sense because they were working within a system created by the troubadours. While one historian, Alfred Genois, called them slaves to tradition, it could be argued that they worked masterfully to create their own roles within a system that was not created by them or for them. Well, sort of for them. Yeah. Anyways, their poetry did not differ vastly from their male counterparts, but they used the same conventions to portray their own messages, so it sort of makes sense that they sounded similar. But these messages did not conform to what Plato would have imagined. While most troubadour poetry was centered around the theme of love, Trobairit's poetry included clear central language that would have been risque even for male poets. Not only were they pushing boundaries with who they were, but also with what they wrote. The significance of their content of their work can be summed up by Sankovich, who says that the Trobairitz were among the first women in Western Europe to embrace the world of vernacular literary discourse, of language not limited to the ephemeral, precarious enunciations that constitute the exchanges of daily life, but of a language meant to be heard and preserved beyond the circumscribed sphere of the domestic. They're not writing about being housewives, people. They're writing about their inner desires. It makes sense then how Meg Bogan, an influential figure in the understanding of Trobairitz today, says that their poetry carried an air of feminism. For one of the first times in European history, women are represented in music as more than meek individuals, and they're represented by themselves, not by men. What's more is that there's evidence to suggest that the Trobairitz were accepted and successful. 4 of Comtessa de Dia's compositions are found in multiple published works, hinting at her popularity, and one 13th century Italian manuscript shows Trobairitz in performance, indicating their work was desired by the public. It's a shame that we don't have more of their surviving work, but I'll take what we do know about them. They may have only contributed to about 1% of French compositions, but they were the first European women of surviving works to have written secular music. So we owe in part the success of Ariana Grande and Olivia Rodrigo and all other secular female artists today to a handful of women who expressed themselves in music almost 1,000 years ago. I'll leave you with a bit of Comtessa's A Chanteur. I must sing of what I do not want. I am so angry with the one whom I love because I love him more than anything. What a change in lyrics from plain chant, am I right? Well, I hope you learned something new today, as did I, about these awesome ladies, and I'll see you next time. I looked this up. I just can't pronounce it now.